Appreciate that. That's quite a mouthful. So, welcome again. I'm so happy to see everyone here. This is a fantastic gathering. I'm so grateful to the organizers of the Downstream Neighbor Conference. These are important. These are important for connecting us in ways that create synergy. And so we're going to try to move that forward a little bit here. As she said, my specialty really is in the law. I have a completely different background from where I'm practicing law now. And just a little bit of background. In 2008, I had been a class action plaintiff's antitrust litigator. That's a mouthful. Bringing lawsuits for monopolization, price fixing against some of the world's great leading largest corporations. And I had my own, as Michael Brownlee calls it, a deep transition around 2007. The pressures of the world, the pressures of the situation, our predicament, were bearing down on me, and I couldn't figure it out. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't figure it out. I couldn't map it out. As a lawyer, that's a very troubling situation. So, one thing led to another. I gave up. I surrendered. And soon after that, all kinds of things just started exploding in my world. And one of the things that I came across was Thomas Berry. An inspiration to me at very deep levels, not just in the language that he used, but in the truths that he was revealing to me, and the connection to law. I suddenly realized that my purpose in life was to carry out this balance that he was trying to achieve between humanity's rights and nature's rights. And that's where evolutionary law arose. Now, this statement by Thomas, why evolutionary law? I went into great lengths internally to understand for my own purposes why I was making this transition. And he said, to achieve a viable human earth situation, a new jurisprudence must envision its primary task as articulating the conditions for the integral functioning of the earth process. Now that's a rich, rich statement. First of all, it recognizes our predicament. To achieve a viable human earth situation means if we are to be viable as a species, a new form of law must come into being that is expressing a framework for how laws can be integral with the earth processes. And so I just started allowing these processes to inform me. And what I decided to do was marry my own history. My history in the law, my history in consciousness, a spiritual journey that's been 40 some odd years, and see why it is that I was brought to this place. So what is evolutionary law? It's a manifestation of earth jurisprudence, which I did not know existed when I started on this journey, and universal law, which I also suspected existed. And earth jurisprudence, some of you may know, there is an earth jurisprudence center in the United States, and I got connected to them. Cormac Cullinan, author of Wild Law, and a Thomas Berry advocate, came into my consciousness. I read Wild Law. I was really taken by the reach of it, the scope of it. And I started finding ways in which Earth jurisprudence was informed by universal law, and we'll talk about a little bit more about that later in the presentation. Universal law is a recognition that laws function according to certain principles that are universal principles. They are, in fact, how the universe functions itself. They are part of consciousness. So I came up with a formulation, that is that laws are the product of intentions and they're the source of actions. And in that continuum between intentions and actions, they function according to principles, universal principles of coherence, resonance. And you'll see here on this diagram, coherence and resonance are part of this process where these aspects of law, laws that enhance the well-being of the Earth community, laws that bring the rights of humanity and nature into balance, very fundamental concept, and laws that foster cooperative evolution. That's a process, okay? And those processes interact together. They're interrelated. Coherence, and what I'll share with you later, is quantum coherence, okay? Resonance. So this is how I see the law functioning. So when I tried to apply this to Colorado's water crisis, and I understand this is a global water crisis, right? But I'm going to talk in terms of Colorado's water crisis, and we'll widen the lens systematically to go from the small to the macro, all right? So this is about individual rights versus exponential growth. That's the tension that I see is at the root of Colorado's water crisis and ultimately humanity's water crisis. And I say that because individual rights is a very seductive, conditioned meme, if you will. It's a meme that has been wrapped in all kinds of concepts around nationalism, around states' rights, constitutional rights. Individual rights becomes a concept separate almost from human rights. Indigenous people would see human rights as being the fundamental, the core rights. Individual rights in the United States especially, and in the Western world, have taken on a character of their own, tied to the Constitution and tied to national laws or state laws. And Colorado is no exception. So the story around water for me, and just full disclosure, I'm not a water law expert. I'm not a Colorado water law expert. One of the things that Thomas Berry has called on all of us to do is become our own experts. All right? To find our calling, that unique combination of gifts that we have, and become an expert in that. All right? And so that's what I'm trying to do. And water is so fundamental to this entire balance between nature and humanity. And that story starts with abundance. Indigenous people have abundance as a framework, right? Because they see in terms of the Earth community, not their own individual survival. Certainly, everyone has that core survival instinct. But certain societies start with memes that are much broader than ours, right? Yes? Memes are cultural ideas, cultural stories that govern our view of life, all right? They're the stories that we tell ourselves and each other And according to Richard Dawkins, at least, who coined the term in terms of how memes evolve, they're like genes. They evolve in the same manner. And while I would disagree in some ways with his formulation that it's only through competition and that those memes evolve, I believe they also evolve powerfully through cooperation. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. That's what they are, all right? And so I will go through some powerful memes that Colorado, the United States, the Western world have operated under. But fundamentally, even if you go to the headwaters of the Colorado River, it seems still like it's abundance. Right? And then we look at the history of the Colorado River, and not just in the last century. Millions and millions of years of history forming that unique aspect of nature. No words can describe how this happened, right? And then we started intervening, and the Western mind sort of took over and intervened in projects that had scope unimaginable to the original people in this country. And the result has been that our downstream neighbors are thirsty. And while this is the Cocopah people in Mexico, just a small boy, we can widen the lens, and I'll show you, and you probably already know, I know in some sense I'm preaching to the converted here, and so forgive me, I'm putting this in context. We can widen the lens to see that it's not just our far downstream neighbors that are thirsty. The Southwest is now thirsty. Colorado is thirsty. Individuals are thirsty, right? And this is our predicament. So I start with a fundamental question. Whose water is it? All right? If we're going to talk about rights to water, let's talk about where we as individuals see our relation to water. And I'd ask you to ask yourselves this question. Do we see in our own heart, do we see water as yours? When you turn it on the tap, you get water and it flows abundantly. Do you see it as yours? Do you see it as your cities, Denver's, in my case, Boulder's, right? Colorado's, the Southwest, because the Colorado River flows throughout the Southwest. We start with that premise, okay? And I would ask everyone to just be honest with yourselves and then raise your hand. If you truly see water as being yours. Anyone? I do. I do. I see it as being mine in a sense that I have a right to live. Okay? I have a right to life. And so, in that sense, it's my right to live. Now, water is also all of these other layers can claim a right to water, including the widest lens, I think, the Earth community. Actually, the universe would be the widest lens. But if we can continually, as we think about water, as we experience these issues, if we can keep that process in mind, that question, whose is it, right? Now in Colorado's water law really got kick-started in the 19th century. These are some just fundamental principles around Colorado water law, and you may know them. And so if I'm stating something, stating the obvious, that's okay. We'll move forward. First of all, it's important to recognize it's an individual private property right that's separate from the land. All right? That in itself takes it out of being integral with the earth community. And so this individual right came from the founding of the country in terms of property rights being enshrined in the Constitution, in various aspects of the Constitution, and early settler life, the opening of the West, claim settlers. And then we started adding layers as competition for water started occurring, as disputes about water started occurring. We started doing almost an ad hoc approach to whose rights there are. And so we said to create a water right, first you have to make an appropriation, right? You have to start using it. And then you have to put it to beneficial use. And someone else will decide whether that's a beneficial use. Then you look at the Colorado Constitution, which has a provision that says the right to appropriate unappropriated water, if it's not already appropriated, you can appropriate it. It shall never be denied. That's a very powerful statement, okay? And then when you combine that with a principle, a waiver principle, so to speak, in law, use it or lose it, this is a recipe for scarcity, all right? May have been well-meaning. It may have been just an honest broker level that the courts were engaging in what they did at the time, which is craft laws that are basically almost like technicians, okay? And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But that's a recipe for scarcity. And so we took Colorado law and it started not only those principles, appropriate unappropriated water, it's a constitutional right. Can't be taken away from you, ever, okay? But first in time, first in right became the law of prior appropriation in Colorado. Under a case called Left-Hand Ditch, a place north of Longmont, some farmers they'd already had water rights, but they wanted more because sometimes their ditches were running dry. So they went to another watershed basically and found a place where they could divert a lake essentially and create more flow, appropriate water. I won't go into the ultimate details. There were lots of disputes, gunplay, this is the West, right? And ultimately they decided, well, it might be better if we went to litigation, okay, instead of shooting each other. So the final decision was, you got it first, you appropriated it first. It didn't matter that it was even in a different watershed from where your original water rights were, but you appropriated it first, you put it to a beneficial use, therefore you get it, even though the downstream neighbors essentially started seeing that they were getting less water, right? So that became Colorado's law. First in time, first in right. And then Colorado law became the law between the states in the West. Wyoming and Colorado had a dispute over the Laramie River. And the Supreme Court decided, you know what? State law, both states basically had this kind of a prior appropriation doctrine, so we're going to let it play out. That's the law that governs disputes between states. Okay, so now we've widened the lens. We started out, this is the 1860s, all right? Their lens was very narrow. Their world was very narrow, right? Now we're talking about states' rights. So we went from individual rights, now we're talking about states' rights. But the same doctrine is applying here. Left-hand ditch is the same source. Yes, I'm sorry. So now we've gone, the law between states is prior appropriation, and first in time, first in right. So then the Southwest started seeing, we may want to rethink this. Be careful what you wish for, all right? Because California was appropriating water first, right? And had designs on these major, huge water projects, Glen Canyon Dam, Lake Mead, Lake Powell, for irrigation purposes for California. No, this is 1920s, okay? We fast forward to the 1920s. It's now become state law, law between the states. Now it's become a regional law, because the other southwestern states, the lower Colorado Basin states, including California, were becoming bigger and bigger users of the Colorado River. Upper Basin states, including Colorado, were starting to get worried because they were seeing that California had prior appropriation rights, and those could be a serious detriment to the other states. So they filed a lawsuit, and ultimately they came up with the Colorado River Compact, 1922, which kept California from essentially fencing the commons, the Colorado River outflow. And the Supreme Court said in Wyoming versus Colorado, remember the prior case, that each state must exercise its rights reasonably and in a manner calculated to conserve the common supply. That created a commons. That was a recognition that there was a commons, but it was still kind of flavored by these states' rights and ultimately the source, an individual rights doctrine, right? So the Colorado River Compact, and I won't go into great detail, but it kind of divided the upper basin from the lower basin, apportioned what they thought was the average flow rate of the Colorado River at the time in half. 7.5 million acre feet per year for the upper basin states, 7.5 million feet per year for the lower basin states. Seemed like a fair, equitable solution. And the upper basin, including Colorado, they must deliver the lower basin's allotment, all right? But no one state could exceed their allotment. And so they thought, okay, this is a way to solve this dispute, right? And then there was a treaty with Mexico, because Mexico historically had for 200 years had been farming on the lower Colorado, and so we included rights, an apportionment of rights for northern Mexico. So at the time of the Colorado River Compact, the population in the southwestern states, and I calculated this population from census data, was about 4 million people, right? In 2010, 57 million people, right? Now, if we go back to the original source in Colorado, left-hand ditch, when that was decided, Boulder County had about 10,000 people. Now there's 300,000. Right? So you're going to start to see a theme here. That's exponential growth with a finite supply, right? So things were okay, and then they started seeing, oops, we misunderestimated. And I'm using kudos to George W. Bush for coining the phrase. Right? But it's actually true. Because they not only underestimated, but they misunderestimated. Because they allocated, under the compact, they allocated 16.5 million acre feet per year in total, right? They thought the average annual flow was 16.4. So they were really pushing the envelope, saying, all right, let's use it all, because of prior appropriation, right? And these doctrines that we talked about. Then they figured out, well, the average annual flow is only 15.1 million acre feet. And that was in the 1940s when they figured that out. They had a problem. So suddenly they've created scarcity, right? And now if we chart a course for how things have actually played out, you start to see that from 1923, after the compact, to 2006, those two lines, whenever you see a chart like that, those two lines intersecting is not a good thing, right? Because that's essentially demand and supply. As an economist, I would tell you, that's a point at which if you have access to more supply, well, price will just go up. But when you don't have access to more supply, you get shortages, right? So then a wild card started to appear. And in the 2000s, we all know that climate change came into our consciousness, right? We started widening the lens to see climate change was a threat. It was a threat on its own merits. We didn't really understand it at first, but it was a threat, right? And now, in the last 10 years or so, we've started to understand that climate change is a threat because of its impact on water. And not just because it's creating droughts, longer, more intense droughts in parts of the country that weren't subject to droughts like that, but also because of the cycles. The water cycle around the globe is being affected, impacted. When I was an undergraduate, I did just a paper, something that intrigued me, the famine in West Africa, the Sahel region of West Africa, and the causes of that. And there was a photo that I saw from Space Lab. This enormous dust cloud stretching from West Africa to the Caribbean. And they essentially did a study about where that dust cloud was coming from, why it was there. And first they started thinking about it in terms of colonialism, and they were changing agricultural patterns. There were desertification issues that were going on, so they were starting to kick up more and more dust. It was interrupting the rain flow cycles off the coast of Africa, right? But now, in the last few years, they've done more studies of persistent droughts in West Africa, in the Sahel region, and they've really come to a link between climate change and disruption of those water cycles. So now we're widening the lens even further to see not just these as separate parts, right? But they're totally interrelated. This is a picture of changing glaciers in California, right? Now, how many of you are familiar with Chris Martenson? Fair number, okay. You may have seen a video. I was going to show a short clip of one of his videos describing problems versus predicaments. All right, Michael Brownlee talked this morning about the predicament that we're in. There's a difference between problems and predicaments. Woman on the left, she's got a problem. All right, she's hanging off of this cliff. Problems have solutions. She's got a rope. Okay, that's a good thing. She's got one hand on the cliff. That's another good thing. She can there's probably a way for her to solve this problem and get back to her original condition, right? But Wile E. Coyote over here, he's got a predicament because there's no way he's going to back up to the top of that cliff, right? So he's going to have to find a way to manage outcomes. Is he going to perish? Is he going to find a way to land in a way that isn't completely harmful? And we know he's a cartoon character, so he actually puff of smoke and then he gets up and he's in the next cartoon. This is what we're facing, all right? And it makes a crucial difference if you see it as a problem or a predicament in terms of what you do, right? If you think you have solutions, that you're just in a problem, and there are technical fixes to this problem, instead of fundamentally rethinking everything about the issue and finding out how you're going to manage a transition to a new state makes a difference. I suggest that we're in a predicament. And our predicament is that exponential growth is meeting finite resources. Right? And one of the things that Chris Martenson does, and I would highly recommend that you look at his crash course site, and particularly about his discussions about exponential growth, because it's everywhere, all right? It's not just in population, although we know we have exponential growth in population. Professor Al Bartlett, some of you may have run across his work. For decades now, he's been talking about this problem, right? In terms of population and energy, right? That fundamental exponential growth is meeting finite energy resources. And Chris Martenson talks about that. Peak oil, the real implications of peak oil, right? On everything in our society, how we live. But this is a classic exponential growth chart, all right? Global population from 10,000 BC to after AD 1 to current times, okay? Notice something, this is called the hockey stick, right? What that's telling us is that all exponential growth patterns speed up at the end, right? And so this is where we are. And I'm going to paraphrase one of Chris Martenson's processes where he takes you through this concept, right? Let's imagine I took you all to Invesco Field in Denver, right? Handcuffed you to the top bleacher, to the top row of seats. And at noon, I went down to the field, and this is watertight, by the way, okay? And I had a magic dropper. At noon, I started with 1 drop, and then every minute, it grew exponentially, okay? From 2 the next minute to 4 to 8, 16, you get the concept, right? How long do you think you would have to escape your handcuffs? Okay, if I started at noon, 30 minutes, anybody else? 3.5, a month? Okay. Every minute, an exponential release of water, okay? He says you would have 45 minutes. Excuse me, 50 minutes. 12:50, all right? Now, and just in case he's misunderestimated the size of Invesco Field by 100%, okay? You get another minute. All right? So 12:51. Now, an important concept, though, is at what point in time is the field still 75% water-free? Okay? 12:45. So you got 5 minutes. All right? You think it's all fine, you know? I've got plenty of time, and then it explodes on you, right? Now, I don't say this in order to scare people or, you know, to raise your levels of anxiety, but like Michael Brownlee, I'm a firm believer in the notion that for us to really move beyond this fear that we're all experiencing, this anxiety, we're all feeling that acceleration. We're feeling everything exponential. It's growing, right? We must go through this. We must face it, right? If you'll hold your questions, I'll address them at the end. Now, federal water law, so let's think about how we're going to solve this in terms of law. And I started looking at, well, is there a federal solution? But federal water law is basically stuck in reverse. I like this guy. He's got a rearview mirror on his forehead. And here's an example, okay? There's a case before the Supreme Court right now. in which the question is, who owns the riverbeds between under 10 dams sitting on 3 Montana rivers, all right? And it's a question of who gets taxed and all that. But the real issue that they have to decide at the Supreme Court is, did Lewis and Clark have to get out of their boat to navigate the Missouri River? That's what they literally are taking evidence on, all right? And so they have historians, and Justice Alito says, well, you know, I'm not a sailor, okay? So how am I supposed to decide this? But this is the problem with federal law in the United States. We operate under a principle called stare decisis, which is basically that what's already been decided, we should leave unsettled, we should leave it alone and not disturb it, because we get benefit from having people understand what the law is, even if it's wrong. I mean, this is how we had Plessy versus Ferguson last for about a century, all right? So what can possibly change these dominant memes around water law? And I say necessity. It's the mother of invention. And there's a nice quote. When we're facing a hanging in a fortnight, it does wonders to concentrate the mind, all right? And that's been the problem in a sense. We haven't been facing that hanging. And now we are. Because we've been looking at Invesco Field and it's been 25% full of water, and we've been thinking, oh, it's okay, we still got time, right? So I can go about my business. Things can stay as they are. And now we're starting to see we're at 1245, right? So existential threats over centuries and centuries have almost always, truly existential threats, have almost always caused societies to shift memes. And I'll give you some examples of that. So as a general rule, this is how I look at these processes, all right? Memes tend to shift first. Laws follow that shift. But the greater the threat, the greater the shift. This is where the hope comes in. Okay. Now, one of the first that I started to look at was that profound shift from the divine right of kings in England to the inalienable rights of all men. What a profound shift that was. We look at it as history books, right? It's almost doesn't have power anymore to understand just how profound that was. Now, what caused it, right? Well, the economic control over the settlers' livelihood caused the Boston Tea Party. They were being squeezed in every aspect of their life, all right? And they truly saw their own existence threatened. And so they took the steps necessary to change that situation. They changed the meme. The meme became every human being is equal. Now, of course, we still had slavery, right? So it wasn't truly a total shift at that point. But look what happened as a result. The Declaration of Independence, the United States Constitution, the Bill of Rights, right? These were amazing developments. Then we started to finish another aspect of this shift, all right? Slavery. Think about it. I mean, again, we sort of take it for granted, but we don't really go back and think about what it was like, what it must have been like to live in a society in which we could own other human beings, all right? And the slavery meme had been in place for 200 years in the colonies, all right? It was in the Constitution. It was enshrined in the Constitution. It was an economic right to own other human beings as property. It took the Civil War to truly shift that meme. The Emancipation Proclamation came about. Again, imperfect. It wasn't a total shift, but it was a fundamental shift. So we went through an existential threat. The country was falling apart, right? 620,000 Americans died. previously unimaginable constitutional amendments came out. The 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, the 15th Amendment to the Constitution. We talk now about amending the Constitution to overturn Citizens United, right? And how hard that process is. We haven't faced truly the existential threat yet. But when we do, these things happen, all right? So, again, imperfect. The South continued to act as if the Civil War had never solved this matter. And so there are other examples. World wars caused major shifts in national sovereignty memes, all right? How we see ourselves as a nation. Now all of this, the atomic bomb, had major shifts in terms of legal issues. The Hague, the creation of the United Nations, universal jurisdiction, which is right now playing out in very unique ways in Ecuador and other places around rights for nature. Okay? These things came out of existential threats. We see it now. The Arab Spring suddenly morphed into the Occupy movement. Right? We don't know where that's going to go, but what we're seeing is that these things are starting to emerge as the existential threat gets very, very powerful. Now, all systems seem to be in breakdown, and I won't belabor this point. You all know this, right? You know every aspect of this, including the corporate dominance over all systems on the planet. But my work is to try to have you look at whether this is breakdown or breakthrough. Okay? And it depends on where your consciousness is, really. If you're deep in fear, and this is not a judgment in any way, all right? Because we all go through these layers of emotional response to this crisis. If you're deep in fear, well, you're probably going to see this as breakdown, right? If you're already expanded, and most people in this room, I'm sure, are, connected to others. That's how you see your survival. Well, you may start to see this possibly as a breakthrough, okay? But first, remember, we have to look at it. Is it a problem or is it a predicament? How do we address these issues, right? Erwin Laszlo says we're at a chaos point. And at a chaos point, I don't know if you've ever had a chance to go to NCAR outside of Boulder, South Boulder, National Center for Atmospheric Research, but they have this chaos pendulum, basically. Those things are wacky. I mean, you just set it in motion and completely unpredictable movements come about, right? Just by setting it in motion. And so what he says is in a chaos window, any input, however slight, can have major impacts, all right? And so can we start to see ourselves as the breakthrough? That's the question, all right? To a caterpillar, it looks like the end of the world. To the rest of the world, it looks like a butterfly. So if we can keep asking ourselves, do I see myself as the caterpillar or the butterfly? Now, I'm not going to belabor this because our time is getting short, but I can tell you that old memes are on their way out and new memes are on their way in. This conference is the perfect example of new memes. Rights for nature, new ways of looking at water, sacred nature of the universe. And I think this last new meme, cooperative evolution, is the key to our survival. That's, in a sense, why we're here, right? Because we see value in cooperating, finding others who are aligned with us. And in my work, how we look at laws that flow with new memes are very powerful. They accelerate the shift. Okay? Once the memes start to shift, if you can craft laws that flow with that new meme and not just against old memes, then you start to really accelerate that shift. So the inalienable rights of men was not a statement that against the king. It was an expression of a new form of rights. And so spreading communion memes, this is, in my view, the way forward. Now this could be a controversial statement to some, all right? Because resistance, true resistance is fundamental to, it's in our conditioning, right? And yet what I'm seeing is my role, and I replace our with my, all right? It's just my job, is to find what's right and spread it. And so this resistance versus cooperation is what we need to every day as we're approaching how to make decisions, right? Are we in resistance or are we in flow? Right now, I hope we take what happens in this conference and we start to find where we can flow, come out of it. Okay? And this is what Thomas Berry said we need to do. We need to elevate the conversation. We need to elevate our focus to begin thinking within the context of the whole planet and the integral Earth community with all of its human and non-human components. Okay? Nature and humanity. And I'm going to leave you with this statement, that there's an unalterable law that governs the entire universe. And so my message to you is, when you're looking at how can you influence laws, think about if your city, if your state, if your nation is considering laws that impact the environment, that impact this balance, find laws that support the commons, support rights for nature, support cooperative evolution, and happiness. Resilience and happiness. Thomas Jefferson said the pursuit of happiness was one of the fundamental principles of the Declaration. And that wasn't just an idle statement, okay? And in this process, if you can think global and act local, and when you're looking at how to have an impact on laws that affect water and water rights, look to the best examples where they're happening, and they're happening in cities, okay? National governments are collapsing in terms of their ability to impact your lives. The United States government is collapsing in terms of its ability to impact your fundamental survival. And so look to your community, look to your broader community. Think globally, connect globally, all right? Let it go. Let go this notion that we have to look to the national government for solutions. Even the state government sometimes, we have to let it go and just focus on what we can do locally with your neighbors, with your local government, with your local community. And if we do that, we're all engaged in what Thomas Berry called the great work. Okay? It's the work of the universe. It's not just our work. It's the work of the universe. So I'm sorry that I've taken so much time, but I'm going to answer questions if you have them. Thank you. Yes.
I can remember when I was in high school and in college in the late 60s and the early 70s, and I can remember I can't remember what textbook it was, but they were talking about Malthus, you know, the Malthusian dilemma. And I can remember how it said that fortunately Malthus was wrong because he did not understand the extent of human ingenuity and creativity and technology. And I think that's the difference between a problem and a predicament, because in those days we saw human population growth as a problem, but the answer existed within our existing framework of solutions.
Yep.
And now I think, yeah, so we're beginning now to understand that as
It's a predicament.
As a predicament.
Yes.
The other observation or thing I wanted to say is that it seems to me that in the current political process, that the meme that is being contested is the meme of free enterprise.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Yeah.
Very powerful. Very powerful. It's in our conditioning. It comes from individual rights. It comes from that constitutional rights background. It comes from the economic rights. And so this is a process. We can look at this as technicians, as you say, try to solve overpopulation as technicians. Okay, and that's why we're looking at climate change. Some people look at it as a technical problem. All right, let's change the way clouds form. Let's change the color of the ocean. Right, instead of what Thomas Berry says is we need to live integrally with the earth processes. And, I'm happy to talk to people after this is over. If you want to take my card, send me an email. Go to my website, evolutionarylaw.com or minddrivelegal.com, and you'll learn more. Yes?
A couple of questions. Wanted to know if you will be participating in it. The School of Law is having a large-scale forum regarding fracking and mineral extraction in Colorado.
Which School of Law? I was not aware of it. I am working with others on the fracking issue, and you know, in an integral way.
I would hope to see some participation by someone like yourself, but I'm sure that they're not planning anything like that. And I want to ask you if there's an opportunity that you might consider creating a periodic meeting with people who are interested in doing just this sort of trying to create laws in their communities, discussing options and so on.
I'm always open to those processes. I am working with people on Boulder County issues, particularly around fracking and just other communities. So yes, I'm perfectly interested in that.